Good morning. My name is Paul Vanas, and I am on the Board of Directors for Education for the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals, Rhode Island chapter. And today I'd like to welcome Keith Fernandes. Keith is a businessman, a local businessman. Also, he runs a couple of organizations, the Providence Apartment Association and the Rhode Island Coalition of Housing Providers. They're a group that started based upon the current needs that are in the market today, especially with the situation growing with COVID-19 and the legislation regarding evictions and moratoriums and whatnot. So we're pleased to have Keith here today to tell us about what's going on in that world. A lot of our members represent clients who have rental properties. A lot of our members own rental properties. So Keith is a valuable resource. He's been on channel, I think 12 and 10, and most of the local networks and news. That's how I found Keith. I saw him on the news one night, and I said, "Well, I gotta get this guy on camera because he knows quite a bit." So, Keith, good morning and welcome.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for having me.
Keith, the situation that's present right now with the moratorium of evictions and whatnot. I know your group is working actively in a lot of these municipalities to basically help out the landlords, because it seems that the tenants have groups and organizations that help them, but the landlords really never had a coalition of sorts to speak on their behalf. And I guess that's what you've been doing, correct?
That is correct. So we have so in the state of Rhode Island, we have a bunch of different groups that were involved with the people who provide rental housing. And so, for example, I am with the Providence Apartment Association. It is Providence, Rhode Island is the biggest, Providence is the biggest city. It's our capital city in the state of Rhode Island. And so we represent a lot of property owners in the city of Providence. We did not really effectively do what we did in Providence statewide. And when COVID hit, with the moratoriums that were introduced by the federal government, Rhode Island had not yet introduced, an eviction moratorium, but the feds had introduced a moratorium. We were caught off guard with something like that. I think the National Apartment Association was caught off guard as to how this was introduced. And we saw the need, an immediate need, for getting everybody who is involved with rental properties in the state of Rhode Island together under one roof. So a couple of groups reached out to me. We have the Rhode Island Real Estate Investors Group, which is headed by Rick Cohn, who's been doing this for quite a while. So he had his group. We had Narragansett 2100, which is headed by George Nonis. That's down in South County. They're having their own issues with legislation that was being passed over there. So they have banded and formed an association. You obviously had the Providence Apartment Association. You had a gentleman called David Sullivan who was running a Facebook page called the Rhode Island Landlord Association. So everyone was doing disparate stuff, and we said it's time to put everybody under the same umbrella. So I talked to a bunch of them. And we got together and said, yeah, we need to do this. Otherwise, we're not going to have a seat at the table. Consequently, we had a core group of people, which was about 40 people, that had some of the biggest property owners in the state of Rhode Island, people who had 4,000 or 5,000 units. And we had people who had an additional building in addition to where they lived. It was all the way down from the smallest guy to the biggest players in the room. And we had a couple of core meetings, and we decided that there were bills that were now being put in the State House in Rhode Island that were absolutely detrimental to anybody who is involved with rental property or providing housing in the state of Rhode Island. Very short-sighted bills, which we will get into, I'm sure, at a little bit later stage. But that is how the Rhode Island Coalition of Housing Providers came about. It's on Facebook. We had to do this really quickly, and Facebook was the most efficient way of doing it. Within a very short period of time, we had over 1,000 landlords sign up just by word of mouth. Just like you said, by watching us on TV, and by word of mouth, it was spreading like wildfire. Now that we're organized, I will tell you this: every politician in the state of Rhode Island who has been paying attention knows who we are, from the governor down. So there's absolutely no mistake as to what we stand for and why we have organized.
Wow. Yeah, I applaud you for your efforts, because it's a voice that's, as you mentioned, it sounded like it was a splintered group, and you pulled all of these different groups together to have one voice. And of course, politically, as you mentioned, whenever you can create a voting block, that's really important to politicians. So tell me right now, Keith, what's the biggest problem you see in the market? If you're a landlord right now and you're not paying, or you're not getting rent, right, mm-hmm. because of the moratorium, how does that affect the everyday landlord?
So most people who are involved with real estate understand what the moratorium was. The moratorium was, so it's a fractured kind of effort. So the federal government has a moratorium, which they've kept extending. Right now it is until the end of June. Certain states also have their own moratorium. For example, New York is just about to extend theirs till the end of August. So the federal government is end of June. New York continues to say, hey, you can't evict till the end of August. So this started in March of last year. So what happened was, by doing that and using the CDC to make that declaration, the federal government effectively said, you have to house people, and if they don't pay, you cannot evict them. They did not say that you can't charge them rent, you can't, because for legal purposes, they tried to cover their position by saying, hey, look, we're not saying that you can't collect your rent, right? But effectively what they did, and they know what they're doing, if a landlord can't evict and a tenant can't pay their $900 rent, at the end of a year, they're not going to be able to pay their, $11,000 or $12,000 that they owe. It's a very simple concept. The problem is, at the end of the day, even if, so they combine, let me just take a step back. So they combine that by saying, well, banks can't foreclose on you if they're backed by the federal government. That sounds really good. So to the layperson, that sounds, okay, you're not getting rent, but you can't get foreclosed on, to the layperson. Anyone who's in the industry understands that any amount that's owed to you, okay, you will not be able to collect. Eventually, when this moratorium on the foreclosures ends, the banks are coming for their pound of flesh.
Sure.
Anybody who owns property is going to be paying that bill. So what effectively it does, it says to me, Keith, you're going to have to pay that bill. You're not going to be able to get anything from the tenant. Maybe you can, maybe you will. We're not saying that you can't go take the tenant to court, but the practical effect of that is you're not going to be able to recollect money from anyone else, but you owe the bill when it's due. So that's what they did with the moratorium. Now, there is federal funding that's available. There was about $15 million in the state of Rhode Island earlier, and a program called Safe Harbor was launched, where landlords and tenants both had to apply for this program. And then if you were approved, they would send you a payment on back rent that was owed. The program was very poorly run. And now, with the latest stimulus package that has been passed in Washington, we have about $200 million that the state has received for rental help, rental relief. So there's a new program in the state of Rhode Island called Rent Relief Rhode Island, and that just launched at the end of March, basically. However, that program's still fine-tuning. They've still got problems in how they're doing it. but there is money available at this point to make a landlord whole. A couple of problems with this program, for example. Both parties have to apply. So a tenant has to apply and a landlord has to apply. A landlord can't just go and say, hey, you know what, I'm not getting paid. If the tenant decides not to do anything, tough luck.
Yeah.
So that's something that's been happening, because what has to happen is that the tenant has to certify, correct, that they are affected by COVID and they're back on their rent and so on and so forth. There's many cases I've heard now that we're doing what we're doing where people just don't care to apply. I mean, I have close friends of mine who have a property, a two-family, that was renovated, rented it out in Feb, and then stopped paying in March of last year. $1,800 a unit. The gentleman's owed over $45,000. He hasn't collected a dime because both tenants don't want to apply for rent relief, and there's no other option. You can't evict them. So there's multiple issues with how this whole moratorium has been done. There's many loopholes for tenants. So the way it works is, if I want to evict a tenant who's not paying rent, I can still file an eviction. But in the state of Rhode Island, all the tenant has to do is sign a piece of paper declaring that COVID has affected their income. And that stops the entire process. So I had a call yesterday where somebody took the tenant to court. The tenant made an agreement with the landlord saying they will move out 1st of April. Okay. The moratorium got extended. This is in court. They had a stipulation, went before a judge, said, okay, you know what? I'm just going to move 1st of April. Everybody signs, you go home. She didn't move on the 1st of April. So the person called me and she went back to court and asked them for what's called an execution. You get an execution if the tenant has not complied with moving out. So in 5 days, you get an execution. The execution, they told her you can't get an execution because the moratorium has been extended. So after getting an agreement in court in front of a judge saying I will move out, and it just said, hey, they extended the moratorium. I don't have to move out now till the end of June, and there's nothing you can do. And that's exactly what had happened. So there's so many loopholes. They certify that they're short on, or they have lost income because of COVID. They sign a piece of paper under the penalty of perjury, mind you, right? That stops the process. Until March 15th, you were not even able to challenge them. They're saying, hey, you go to work every single day. You're making the money and you're saying that you don't have the money because you lost income. You couldn't even challenge them until we started banging the drum and saying, how is that even possible that we're not allowed to go to court and say to the judge, we're not making the decision. We're asking the judge to make the decision, saying what they have certified is incorrect. They still have their job. They're still making income, but they're not paying their rent. You didn't have that opportunity. The judges, the Supreme, the District Court Chief Judge LaFazia, who I have to give credit to. I mean, Justice LaFazia has been excellent. Certainly understands what's going on. Starting 15th of March, you're now able to go into court, and the tenant has to, the landlord has to prove that the tenant hasn't lost income. But if you can prove that, they will then let you evict the person.
So as of now, right, as of April 29th, you can still file for an eviction, and the normal procedures are used. The sheriff would serve the tenant just like they would for prior to COVID. Right. And however, what happens if this all happens before June 30th or after June 30th? Is there a difference?
Well, you can get a judgment against a tenant, but you can't do anything until the eviction moratorium ends. Now, the thing is, they've been renewing this, and they've been extending it every couple of months. So what's to say that they don't extend it till August? And then when August comes around, they extend it again till December, correct? And that's exactly what's been happening, is that they keep extending it. So some of these bills that were put in Rhode Island, for example, so as I was saying earlier, the feds, there's two moratoriums. One is the Fed that has this till June. And then you have like Massachusetts and New York both have their own moratoriums, state of emergency moratoriums. New York is planning to extend theirs till the 31st of August. So even when the feds end, the New York moratorium will be in effect. Well, the bill that we opposed was in Rhode Island. They put in a bill, both in the Senate and in the House, that said during a state of emergency, okay, absolutely no evictions allowed, which was, pretty similar to what New York and Massachusetts have done. And we were of the opinion that says, wait a second, the bill, first of all, as written, was just completely a disaster. It said, during a state of emergency, there shall be no evictions. So we said to them, when I spoke to some of the top politicians, I said, does that mean if there's a flood in Warwick, that tenants in Providence don't have to pay their rent if you declare a state of emergency? Now, you have to declare a state of emergency if there's a flood in Warwick, because that's what you need to do to get federal funding and federal help. The governor has to declare a state of emergency. That's the only way you'll get federal funding. So as written, the bill would mean that if something like that happened, tenants in Rhode Island don't have to pay their rent. It made absolutely no sense, just open-ended. The second part to that bill, they added a mandatory mediation clause. So this is where bill creep comes in. So what's happening in the state of Rhode Island is they have taken the pandemic, and instead of addressing what needs to be addressed in a very limited, targeted way to help people that have lost their jobs. I mean, most landlords have worked with their tenants. Absolutely nobody wants to evict somebody. Certainly not in a time like this. But what has happened is they've taken something that should have been very specific. They could have said, state of emergency during a public health crisis, like what we're going through, for example, okay? Couple that with, let's say, funding, that the state must make you whole. If there's an issue, if your tenant's not paying rent, we're going to help pay, have somebody pay. We're not going to just say, hey, you have to deal with it like they've been doing, right? Then it makes a little bit more sense to people. You can't put the burden just on us. But what these guys have been doing is they're throwing the book at us. They're adding so many, what I think are very devious things. They added a clause that says you have to have mandatory mediation going forward. Now, that was regardless of if there's a state of emergency, regardless of anything. So one of the clauses that we found in that bill was that says that when you go file an eviction, it will not show up because you have to go and have mandatory mediation. The court's going to appoint mediators that are going to come and probably investigate what's going on and try and come to a resolution between you and the tenant. And then if you can't come to a resolution, then you will get to go before the judge. Okay? So that basically what that does is it extends the whole process of an eviction from, in best case scenario right now, if everything goes according to plan, 15 days you have before you can send a letter, a 5-day demand notice if they haven't paid. And then if they still don't pay on the 21st day, you file an eviction. And then technically 9 days later, you're supposed to be in court. So that's 30 days. This is absolute best case scenario, never happens. Okay? Let's assume you win your case and you come to an agreement and the tenant has to move out. The tenant still usually gets another week or so to move out, correct? If the tenant doesn't move out, you got to come back to court to get what's called an execution, 5 days after the judgment. So you're adding another week there. And then by the time you've gone through the whole process of renovating, fixing whatever's damaged or whatever, you're looking at 2.5 months. That's the absolute fastest to turn around an apartment by the time you get it re-rented. With the mandatory mediation, you'd add on another 2 months.
Hmm.
So for your listeners and viewers, who in their right mind will invest in property? Okay, in the state of Rhode Island, if it's right now it's taking you about 2 months, if it's going to be 4 or 5 months before you can evict a person, what will that do to existing, sales of rental property? And one of the things that angers me, and this is something that your listeners will appreciate. I think when I look at the makeup of people who are buying multifamilies, it's the minority.
Mhm.
Okay, they're first-time houses. They usually don't qualify for a single family. Okay, buying a multifamily is their best way to get into home ownership because you have other units helping pay the rent, which they would have never qualified for if there was no income coming in. So banks will start tightening their lending standards, as you would know, saying, "Hey, wait a second, now we gotta, be a little bit more conservative because, if somebody doesn't pay, there's a chance that you're going to have to come up with the money, right? Because in a normal situation, the bank doesn't care if your tenant's not paying rent, right? In this situation, they're forced because the government has forced them to be a little bit more hands off. What happens to, instead of encouraging the Latinos, the minorities, people of color, to get into home ownership, which is a solid way to build wealth. You know this really well. I'm a minority. I'm an immigrant. I'm from India originally. I came to this country with $500 in my pocket, and I got into real estate eventually, and now I own a bunch of property. And I encourage everybody I know to get into it. It's hard work. The payoff's not immediate, but eventually the hope is that there will be a payoff. So for the minorities who want to get into this business, instead of encouraging them, we're telling them, hey, you know what? We're making it riskier for you. So why would they ever want to get into something like that and get in over their heads? So that bill, there's a House bill, it's 5309, and Senate Bill 183, I believe. They're the companion bills, the mandatory mediation. We were completely against it. We said, listen, the CDC is making this decision. Let's just follow them for now. Okay, let's work this out. But you gotta process, some sort of evictions. And I hate calling it evictions, but that's the legal term for it. And if you don't process things as you go along, what's going to happen, Paul, at the end is when you say, all right, let's remove all this emergency, and that we're getting to that point with all the vaccinations and so on and so forth. Then they keep talking. Then they talk about the other side. There's going to be a tsunami. Well, why is there a tsunami? Or why do you think there'll be a tsunami? Because you haven't allowed it to happen in a staggered fashion.
Sure.
Right? So you can't have it both ways. So that's one of the bills, the state of emergency bill that's pending both the House and the Senate. They've both been held for further study.
I see. Well, I'm glad that you're in there plugging for the landlords, because normally, if you weren't, Keith, they probably would have passed.
Oh yeah.
the initial legislation, and now your hands would be tied even more. Especially, I know, like right now, because I own a brokerage company as well. 2-family houses are $500,000 in some markets. 3-family houses are selling in excess of $600,000, $200,000 a unit, and to take for a person who's, especially a first-time home buyer, as you mentioned, to take on that kind of debt and then not have the income coming in that they use to qualify for the mortgage is so detrimental. So, boy, you brought a lot of good information to the table. We got about 4 minutes left. Keith, if you can give a synopsis, just to our listeners who may have a problem right now, if you can give a scenario to a landlord right now who's kind of not getting his rent, what should they do right now? What avenue should they take?
So in the state of Rhode Island, as of now, so we are following the federal government's guideline, which is you can't evict. Well, you can do the paperwork for eviction, but you can't actually evict somebody. So what we're saying to people right now is, so there's a couple of different ways to do this. First of all, I'll repeat myself. Nobody wants to evict. Absolutely nobody wants to evict a good tenant. Most of the good tenants have either paid their rent or come to an agreement with their landlords. Okay, what we're concerned about is the tenants who have taken advantage of this situation. So what I will say is document. You have to start documenting. I have a situation currently where tenants are not getting along in the building. There's a tenant that's creating a lot of disturbances in the building, but you can't do anything. But I'm documenting it because there is no substitute when you go before a judge to have proof that there's an issue, right? So that is just not your say. I've had the other tenants write a testimonial. They will show up in court to testify, for example. There's not really much you can do in terms of moving somebody out, unfortunately. There are a couple of ways you can do it, but it's very case specific. So I would encourage you to talk to an attorney that knows that knows some of these more challenging. The declaration is one, for example. If you feel that the tenant is taking advantage and they're working, challenge the declaration. There's a couple of points, 4 or 5 points that you can challenge it on. And if a judge agrees that they're lying and so on and so, then you can move forward with an eviction. Another is applying for these programs. So if you can't evict somebody, at least get paid. So Rent Relief RI is open. They're accepting applications. Talk to your tenants. Communicate. That's another thing. There are tenants who don't want to communicate. There's no doubt about that. Unfortunately, they're protected the way it goes. Finally, there's also lawsuits that have been filed nationally. That's something that all listeners should know. 2 recent judgments, in federal court have gone in favor of landlords, saying, we don't think that what you're doing is constitutional. There's a constitutionality issue over here, and the lawyers that I've spoken to, we've got a bunch of them in our group. A lot of them, there's some disagreement, but there's also consensus that there's a takings clause. But what that means is it says, I'm taking your rights to your property away from you. I'm telling you that you have to do this, but you may or may not get paid. I don't see people walking into Whole Foods or Stop and Shop picking up food, which is an essential, and telling them, hey, I'll pay you when I can. You've never seen that, because what would that be called, Paul? That would be called theft. Right? So, but it's okay for us to provide services. There are people who depend on this income for retirement. There are people who have had properties for a long time, and this is how they're surviving. So you're telling that people pay for their kids' college education, lots of different things. So there's a lot of unresolved. This is going to end up in the Supreme Court of the United States. That's where it will get decided whether what they did was okay or not.
Excellent. Well, Keith, this has been a wealth of information. And I'm glad you had the opportunity to condense it into a little 30-minute presentation here, because it would take someone else normally hours and hours on the telephone calling different people to kind of figure out which route to go into. So I want to thank you and thank your group for doing the diligent work that they're doing on behalf of landlords. And hopefully, as things progress, we can get you back here, and you can talk to our viewers about what changes have been made, what updates have been made, especially in this Rhode Island 5309 legislation. I know there is a challenge to that. The Blaisdell Act, I guess, of 1934 was the law that in the Supreme Court that they're challenging. So, again, we want to thank you on behalf of the Rhode Island chapter of the National Hispanic Real Estate Professionals Association, Keith Fernandes of the Rhode Island Coalition of Housing Providers. And Keith, before we go, if you can just tell our listeners any websites, any emails. You mentioned Facebook. Can you just give them a brief synopsis on how to get a hold of you?
Sure. If you are a Providence rental property owner, go to providenceapartmentassociation.com, or you can look for it on Facebook. If you own property in the state of Rhode Island, you can go to the Facebook group that's been formed. We're still in the process of putting the rest of it together, but there's a very active Facebook group, Rhode Island Coalition of Housing Providers. And just go there. It's verified landlords. We verify you before we let you enter, so we know that you're an actual housing provider. And the only way we can fight back is by getting the word out. I need more Latino real estate professionals to get involved. We have a ton of realtors. We have over like 250, 300 realtors. I need more people from the Latino population to get involved. They are getting involved. I'm seeing much higher numbers. We'd love to have your members join our group and be at the forefront, because as you know, a lot of realtors also own rental property.
Excellent. Thank you, Keith. We appreciate your time, and
Very welcome.
Best wishes, and hopefully we'll have you back soon.
Very welcome. Thanks for having me, Paul.
Thank you.